This week's Parsha is Parshas Vayeitzei, and in it we learn of the story of Yaakov Avinu leaving his father's house at the advice of his mother and traveling to his mother's brother's house, his uncle Lavan, of whom we have previously met and heard in the previous Parsha, because we find that there is a family, a very large family, to Rivka, and they are living in Haran. So he's sent there. And the story has multiple parts to it. And one thing I want to focus on over here is an interesting motif that the Midrash points out. This is a Midrash in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. It's in chapter 36. And it's something that I want to share with you. And then we'll talk about the Midrash and its attempt to address this motif in the storyline and in multiple storylines. So let's talk about it for a second. So when a piece of literature picks and decides on a motif, it is trying to use it as a narrative device. And there's something in there that helps us to recognize that there's something in the story that we should expect to happen. So they sometimes have that. Sometimes a broader category called like plot devices, but this is different. This is something in the motif that recurs. It helps the narrative flow better. And the Midrash in Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer picks up on this. The thing that's interesting is in chapter 36, it starts with Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer is interesting because it's sort of a narrative Midrash itself. It picks up on themes and adds stories and adds context outside of the actual narrative itself. And it tells us the Midrash of how the rabbis themselves understood the broader category about it. Let's take a look at this. So the Midrash opens up by quoting a pasuk in Mishlei, the book of Proverbs. It says, V'lechtecha, not u'v'lechtecha. V'lechtecha lo yetzer tza'adecha im tarutz lo tikashel. Okay? So when you go, your steps should not be straightened out, and when you run, you should not stumble. Okay? So the idea is that everything should go well. So the Midrash says that that the walking pattern, the travel pattern of Yaakov when he goes to Haran were not interrupted. Instead, he comes in very powerfully. Why? Because he's able to push this giant stone off of the well. So the Midrash is drawing from our understanding of the context. The context is that Yaakov has already had his dream in the parasha, and we've read about that. So he has the dream of the angels going up and down the ladder, and God says, I'll be with you when you go to Haran. He goes to Haran, and he meets these shepherds. And meeting shepherds, everyone meets shepherds. There's meeting shepherds all throughout the thing. That's not the interesting part of the story. The interesting part of the story is what comes up next. So he goes out and he sees that there's, a rock on top of the well. And the shepherds are all waiting there. Why? So, well, they wait for everybody to come in. And then they toll it off. They say, what are you waiting for? Oh, we're waiting for Lavan and his family's flock to show up. And then we roll the stone off. So the main point of the story at this point, according to the Midrash, is to explain why Yaakov has to roll the stone off of the well. It's to demonstrate that in the course of his journey, many people become weakened and ineffectual after a long journey, and they have to rest. But not Yaakov. He runs into this story at full strength. And it says that not only was he at full strength, but also the water rises up out of the well to meet the people standing there. And people were amazed by this. Why? Because they altogether couldn't roll the rock, right? And he could. So it says Yaakov came close and he rolled the rock off. Now that's also after he sees something else. So we see that the first thing that is the part of the setup of the story is to explain how Yaakov is very, very well off at this point, very capable, and in some ways even more capable and more powerful than those around him, who seem to be much more settled. And then this is the this is the narrative part that the Medrash starts to talk about. Rabbi Akiva says that someone who goes into a city and he finds the maidens exiting before him, right? Matzah na'arais yaitzeis lefanav. He encounters young women, maidens, exiting before him. So, how do you know that this is a good thing? Okay, this is a good thing. This is nachon, right? And so he says, okay, first time we know this is from the story of Eliezer. Because what happens? It says, I'm going to stand by the water, and I'm going to first one who comes out. And what does he get? Hashem hatzliach darki, right? That's the Midrash says that, and that's what Eliezer says. That's back in chapter 24, okay, in Bereshis. And the next time we see a case like this, who else has some success at a well? Moshe Rabbeinu. Why? Because here he was sitting outside the city, and the young ladies were coming out. Why? Because it says to the Kohen Midyan, he had 7 daughters. So he's standing there, and out come all the daughters, right? And so he was able to go and redeem the Jewish people from Egypt. That's what it portends. And how do we know that another case where it was good? In another case we find from Shaul. Because before he got into the city, so this is in the first book of Samuel. This is in chapter 9. And we find that he hasn't even made it into the city yet. He's on his way in, and he's met by young maidens. And in fact, the sort of meta comment on this midrash, the Gemara in Brachos says that he was so attractive that not only these maidens go out, they even strike up a conversation with him. The Navi was trying to point out about how successful he was going to be. So they come and they say, where else do we find that one is successful? Okay, so Shaul becomes king, right? So where else? And what's the final case over here? By Yaakov, because Rachel came out to the Be'er, right? So that's it. Okay, so that is the interesting value in the story of having the young maidens come out before him. So that is an important part of the story. Now, why is that important? So because the Midrash over here is very long. It goes through a lot of other important parts of the Parsha, but here it talks about specifically one point of it, and it draws out more context for the story. That's how Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer works. But I want to focus on this one point of the idea that when he gets to the city, this is not only an experience that he has, but this is a motif that reappears commonly throughout Jewish history and is used by the Nevi'im and in the Torah as well, to say that when you see this thing, it portends something good. Now, generally speaking, we're not allowed to do that, right? Not to be a Melanain Mechashef. One can't stand outside, right? It's in Yardei Kaftun Zion. One can't stand outside and look for little things in the world to happen and use those events to determine what the future looks like. However, when you're telling the story, you can use this as a device. Why is this device important? What is it really telling us? So it's an interesting way for the reader to be reassured that at this point everything is good. And why is that important? Because at all of these points, our main character in all of these stories already has some anxiety about what the future holds. And Yaakov is really, in those cases, is really the first one who has that. What do I mean? So before Yaakov goes out to Haran, and he goes out into these unfamiliar places in the east, he spends a lot of time, according to the Midrash, in the yeshiva of Shem Ve'ever. He spends a lot of time learning and preparing himself. And then he finally makes the journey, and he's still nervous. And even Rashi points out at the beginning of the Parsha, he says that the reason why Yaakov needs a lot of reassurance is because he has an experience that's very different than his father and his grandfather. Whereas he's being told he's going to continue the promises laid out in the Beris Bein HaBesarim for Abraham. I'll be with you, I will guide you, I'll make you into a great nation, I'll bring you back to this land, you'll be great here. There still needs to be some type of reassurance that these things are going to be okay. So when he leaves Base El, and here he arrives in a place outside of Haran, at the well, we say it was outside of Haran. It's important for two things to happen. One, that Hashem has already reassured Yaakov Avinu that he's going to protect him. But how do we know that that's going to be okay? How do we as the person now reading the story know and appreciate that these things are going to be okay? So when you're outside of the person hearing the story, you don't really know how they feel unless the Torah tells us how they feel. We have to wait for the Torah to give us some type of reassurance that they're feeling this way. We don't know otherwise. For example, the Gemara Megillah argues, how do we know whether or not the story of the Megillah was written with divine inspiration? How do we know it was written by someone who was a Navi? There's no indication that it was. Hashem's name is not mentioned. Hashem doesn't speak to anybody. His name is not found throughout the entire thing. So the Gemara says, it's really simple. Because Yomar Haman Beliboy. Haman says something in his heart. How do we know what's in his heart, if not for the fact that we have some indication of some divine intervention? Hashem has to reveal this to us. But we're going to take a guess. I'm guessing. In the air, we find Haman felt this way. It had to be that the story was delivered with a level of inspiration that allowed some form of clarity to let us in on that aspect of the story. And this is what the Midrash is talking about by saying that we experience numerous times throughout Jewish history that in situations that are high anxiety, we have something to let us know that everything's going to be okay. So by Yaakov, how do we know everything's going to be okay? Well, number one, he rolls the stone off, but that's he's okay. And then the second thing is that the Naros Yotzaos, right, the young ladies come out, is a narrative device that allows us to understand as the reader that everything's going to be okay. So by Yaakov, we know that he's going to be fine in his experience here in Haran. Everything's going to be okay. Now, how does that play out? Well, there's other ways in which we experience that. We understand that when he leaves with two angels, and he builds the Matseva and Beis El, and when he returns, he's greeted by angels, and he sees them exchanging. So the idea of the angels, one of the simple meanings of it is, as Rashi points out, quoting the Midrash Tanchuma, is that there are sets of angels that meet you as you come into and out of the land of Israel. And the Ramban understands a little differently. He says that you don't actually feel or experience the exchange, but you become aware of it. And the reason why he says that is because Gal Eid is set up outside of Ma'avar Yavok. They haven't crossed into the land of Israel, so if you haven't stepped over the river, you don't actually get the protection. It's like Hashem is not air conditioning the outside, so He's not providing the same. When you go into the house, you get the AC. When you're outside the house, you're not getting the AC, so you don't get that special Eretz Yisrael protection while you're there, but you get the Chutz La'aretz protection. But the point being is that we as someone who's experiencing this outside of it, we need to know that we're being communicated that something is okay. So there's an anxiety and a buildup for Yaakov that he experiences something that his grandfather and his father didn't experience, which was he had somebody pursuing him actively in Esav. And he was going to a very unfamiliar place where he didn't know he was going to be okay. And he's traveling by himself. He has nothing there. And so in all of these other situations, everyone experiences a similar level of anxiety. So it's by Moshe Rabbeinu, he has left everything, he's by himself. He doesn't know what really holds the future for him. But because the Naros come out, we now experience what he's feeling with this protection of Hashem, that when he flees Egypt and comes here, he's finding a secure place. And that's how we know everything's going to work out for him. Even though for him it's a much longer story. By Shaul, now, it's a long story that doesn't in the end work out for him, but it works out for him to get the kingship because people have been asking for a king, and that part of the story, the kingship, works out for him, and that's why that's an important part of it. And same thing over here. So those are the four cases cited to say that when you experience those things, that everything is going to be okay. And sometimes in life we have to kind of look for those events when we can't sometimes calm our own inner voices that make us feel like we are not in a secure place. Sometimes we go into different things and we say things to ourselves. Maybe I don't feel like I'm making the right decision. Maybe I don't feel that I'm going to have the support that I need. Maybe I don't have all of these things. But sometimes you have to believe and you have to assure yourself that when you're doing the right thing, unless, of course, somehow an angel appears to you and puts you in connection with Hashem, and you have a conversation. But in lieu of that, you have to feel like you can trust in what you're doing because you have been following in the ways of Hashem. And that is the important part of the conversation between God and Yaakov, is that it's not just God gives him the reassurance, it's that by following in his ways, he will be reassured. And there will be things that will happen to you that can help you to feel better about those decisions. So in the case of Yaakov, he sees the maidens come out in the evening, and that makes him feel better. It makes him feel more secure. It makes him feel more comfortable in his decision. And he can do, and we as the reader who experienced it should take that lesson to heart. That sometimes we make a decision where we don't know how it's going to play out. Even though we have all the assurances, we're never really fully 100% sure. And we could talk and develop this more, this idea in Yaakov's own experience with how he wasn't sure everything was going to work out because he loses Yosef, he lost all those things. Maybe it all wasn't going to work out in the end. But at least in this sort of microcosm over here of his experience, his journey into Chutz La'aretz and into the Eretz B'nai Kedem, he has those feelings. He has that assurance, and he has that experience behind him to let him know that so far in this part of the journey, everything's going to be okay. The rest of the story, well, let's not worry about that. But for right now, we should know that everything is going to be okay.